Good afternoon. Can someone confirm that I'm audible?
Vanessa, you are indeed.
Thank you so much, Prof. Good afternoon, everyone. Afternoon/evening. I'm sure across most of the continent, we are all in our late afternoon/evening. Welcome to webinar 4 hosted by the SU Africa Global and Public Health Student Network. Today's topic is trade policy and global health and the implications for Africa. And I'll just quickly go through the ground rules. Next slide, please, Willie. So I'll just be quickly going through the ground rules, introducing the initiative, and then Relile Dube, who is a PhD student who's also part of the core team, will be introducing the team, and then we'll have our speaker introductions and go through our 2 speakers going through the different topics. Each speaker will be followed by Q&A. Just in terms of the housekeeping rules, we'd just like to request you please mute your mic when you're not talking. You can use the raise the hand function if you'd like to say your question out loud, but also please just do engage in the chat box as well. If you have questions that pop up as we're going through the process of today, you can put them in the chat. You'll be given the opportunity to read out your questions out loud later on. But just so you don't forget anything, please do make use of the chat. And then just moving on, yeah, that's it for house rules. Yeah, please do engage and do comment. Just giving an overview of the initiative. So this is the SU Africa Global and Public Health Student Network. It's SU, for those who don't know, that's Stellenbosch University. And the purpose of this initiative is to build an African global and public health network, which is a community of practice that is student and youth focused, focused on enhancing the knowledge, practice, and skills that are required by those who are on the African continent, who will be required to deal with current as well as future global health and public health issues relevant to the African continent. Yeah, this network was established out of a need. We could see that on the continent, there isn't much available in terms of those who want to go into the public health or global health space. There isn't much mentorship, and there isn't a widely established community yet. So this is established. It's called the Student Network, but it's basically for everyone, because no matter what level you are in terms of your public health or global health career, we are all lifelong learners. And the purpose of this initiative is, in addition to building this community of practice, to transform students into change agents and leaders by empowering them with the knowledge and skills that they require. And the purpose of this network is to be a space where we can co-create with students across the African continent and share our learning experiences. So this initiative was first thought about during COVID. So yeah, COVID just really emphasized the need and also highlighted the opportunities that we have to network and contribute beyond the different borders of our countries. And there's also been multiple requests by students such as myself at Stellenbosch University within recent years to sort of start up something of this kind. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just in addition to this, so we have the need that has been brought up by students at Stellenbosch University and other African other universities on the continent. And then we also have the Africa CDC, that is an African Union who are prioritizing public health on the continent, and the new public health order for Africa, which seeks to address structural public health deficiencies at a national, which started out with this webinar series, will grow beyond this. And there will be more opportunities to engage outside of the webinar space. So that is it for the initiative overview. I'll be handing over to Relile Dube, who will be introducing the team further.
Evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. So this team is led by Professor Renee English, who is the acting HOD of the Global Health and the head of Division of Health Systems and Public Health. And then we have Vanessa Anand, who is a last year medicine student. And then we have Nhlakanipho Chalago, who is a 5th-year student. And then we've got Tulo, who is a 3rd-year student. And then we also have Stacy, Blows, who is also a PhD student. Then we've got myself. Then we've got Dr. Juliet Nyasulu, who is a senior lecturer in the Division of Health Systems and Public Health. And then lastly, we have Dr. Lynn Hendricks, who is also a lecturer in the Division of Health Systems. So this initiative.
You can go ahead.
Yeah, so this initiative is made of students from different countries, that is including South Africa, Cameroon, Kenya, Sudan, Malawi, Uganda, Liberia, and Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wulilia Dube, for introducing the core team. So currently our students within the core students within the initiative that can be found on our website are spread across the following countries, as mentioned, but there are more students who are part of our network or our initiative who are not necessarily part of the core team that extend to other countries. And we do hope that this will indeed become a SU-led Africa Global Health and Student Network. Over to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. It seems like the student who was supposed to do the introduction of the speakers is having some network issues. I'll just like to ask before I go ahead, is Aruhu here? Are you able to introduce Prof. Lizan? Okay, I will go ahead. So our first speaker for today is Prof. Lizan du Plessis. She has a PhD. Prof. Lizan is a lecturer in the division in public health and community nutrition in the Division of Human Nutrition at the Department of Global Health at the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences, Stellenbosch University. She's a duly registered as a dietitian as well as a nutritionist with the Health Professions Council of South Africa. Prof. du Plessis has experience which expands over 28 years of engagement when it comes to public health nutrition. She has a special interest in research focused on the environment and the effects that it has on maternal, infant, as well as young child nutrition, as well as early childhood development. This includes policy, governance, advocacy, and leadership issues, as well as health, nutrition, and promotion. She currently lectures postgraduate modules to nutrition students, and as well as undergraduate modules to dietetics, physiotherapy, nursing, as well as medical students. And she also provides study leadership for undergraduate as well as postgraduate research projects. She's an active within various community and working groups with a link to social impact, amongst other things. And then she's other things in the Western Cape government, the Department of Health, and Infant Young Child Feeding Technical Working Group. She is a scientific chairperson of the International Congress for Dietitians and Nutrition, which was hosted from South Africa in 2021. Prof. du Plessis, we're also honored to have you today for the first session, and we're looking forward to hearing from you and learning from you today. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to ask you, please, Vanessa, to also introduce Professor Scott Drummy, since he will be starting off our presentation, if that's possible.
Okay, we'll do so. I wasn't aware that it was a joint presentation. I will do so. Thank you so much for that notification. So I'll also introduce Prof. Scott Drummy, who also has a PhD. So Prof. Scott Drummy is both a researcher as well as a facilitator who's working on food systems in Southern Africa, taking on a large political, largely political economic lens. He's focused primarily on food policy and the facilitation of new institutional arrangements for food system governance. Scott's academic career pivots on his role as an associate professor extraordinary at the Department of Global Health in the School of Public Health and Leadership. He also co-designs and facilitates learning processes across many thematic areas at the center. Professor Scott has directed the Southern African Food Lab since 2013. This is a multi-stakeholder initiative that brings together actors from across regional food systems to identify and pilot innovative means to achieve long-term sustainable food security. This is done through the lens of collaborative learning and facilitation process. The Food Lab is hosted at the Faculty of Agri-Sciences at Stellenbosch University. Thank you so much, Prof. Scott, for also being here today. We're looking forward to it.
So thank you very much indeed. And it really is a pleasure to be here. So just on behalf of Lizana and myself, we've really enjoyed thinking about what we're going to talk about today with you and learn with you. What is very striking for us is that this topic, global health, trade, policy, although it seems ostensibly like something that we should be well on top of, is a relatively new area for a lot of public health professionals to really get to grips with the economics of trade, to get to grips with the business, the big institutional arrangements that sit behind these movement of goods and resources globally. And in many ways, the question requires different disciplines to come together to be able to make sense of something that is absolutely imperative to understand these outcomes around health and nutrition in particular, and what we will talk about today. But also, if we're going to shift things and use this power of international trade for the public good. So for us, it's important that we recognize you as global activists that will step into a space which requires new thinking, new research. And what we hope to do today is to offer a conceptual framework that helps us understand these interconnections, but then also by focusing on nutrition in particular, to make visible some of these real power dynamics that lie behind it. So the way we're going to do it is I'm going to lay out the framing. So I'm a political economist, a historian. I work with some of these bigger institutional issues. I'll use those that kind of lens to lay out that conceptual framework. And Lizanne's going to take us right down into really thinking about the implications for health and nutrition. And that's the way we're going to bring it together. So if we just go on a little bit, Lizanne, I'm just going to ask you to manage the slides, please. When we think about this whole issue of global trade, things that come to mind for me is the notion of globalization. At the end of World War II, there was extraordinary devastation globally, but there was also a rapid restructuring of different powers. With the ascendancy of the US, the Soviet Union, China to some extent, it was very much setting up what became the Cold War. Part of the reestablishment of relationships was this belief that by setting up markets and trade, by bringing countries and connecting them and making them dependent on each other, would in fact work some way towards peace building. And this was ostensibly some notions, particularly through the United Nations, and then ultimately through the establishment of entities like the World Trade Organization. This is a very almost naive way of thinking about global trade or globalization, because as we know, it's not as if markets work freely and openly, but there are differences in terms of not only in terms of an exchange for one good or the other, but in fact there are who sets those terms of trade, who ultimately sets the frameworks. And so this thing is embedded in deep structures of power. They are also deeply influenced by what happened in the 50s and 60s, which was basically the European empires, the colonies, essentially being released as they sought their own independence. And so from the 50s and 60s, you saw the rapid decolonization, particularly of Africa. You saw countries, as they aligned with each other in regions, also began to set up trade arrangements, trade agreements. But just by using that word decolonization, I immediately begin to put a light on the fact that these are relationships that are embedded in the past, that they're not neutral and they're not at equal starting points. I think this is very, very important. If you just press one button, Lizanne, I would like to then draw our attention to how, when we think about the notion of food and we think about food trade and globalization, you can see in the center of this very complicated diagram the whole idea of a food chain. Production of food, that moves through various stages to ultimately reach the plate of people. Yes, it is in some ways a linear model, but the way it's been presented in the beginning is that it has this arc, it's circular. But what's important is that around it are these intersections with other systems. And if we look carefully at this particular diagram, this illustration of a food system, we see in the blue to the left, the economy, where trade sits very, very centrally. But we also see to the far right, in terms of red, health, with at the top center, politics. And it's really that I really want to now focus in on. So the outcomes of a system are often about food security. So the food system exists in terms of different elements, and those elements are interconnected. They have a rationale, a reason for the interconnections, and they produce something. And that thing which they produce is called food security. I'm not going to go into that. I'm not going to go into the theory. Just bear with me in terms of this. So I want to offer to you a conceptual framework that brings together some notions of politics, of economics, of health, through the lens of trade, particularly the trade of food. I'm not going to call it nutritious food. I'm just going to call it food, that have this so-called outcome in terms of food and nutrition security or food and nutrition insecurity. I hope you're with me and you're okay with this in terms of where I'm going. So let's look at this conceptual framework a little bit. So Lizanne, on to the next slide. I've been really struck by the work of Garcia Dorado and his colleagues in terms of the work that they've done in terms of really trying to synthesize, distill the evidence that we've got globally in terms of the relationship between globalization, global trade, and questions around health outcomes. And what Lizanne adds to this is that she takes those health outcomes and she looks particularly at nutrition. So let's look at this part of the system that I've got visible up ahead from you. It's the whole idea of globalization. You can imagine Europe to the north. You can imagine the United States and Canada to the northwest. We can imagine basically the Soviet Union, China, Southeast Asia to the northeast. And as you move towards the south, we find Africa. A little bit to our left, we see countries in Latin America, Central America, and to our right, Australasia. All of these countries interconnected in some ways with the movement of those massive ships, air freight, different kinds of connections, moving goods, moving food, governed in terms of agreements that are made between countries in these different places. The countries such as the United Kingdom, i.e. the previous colonial power, making an arrangement with a country like Ghana in terms of, let us enter into some form of exchange. We'll take your cocoa and we'll take some of your raw materials. In exchange, we will bring you, for example, produced good, manufactured goods. That in turn can morph into, for example, some kind of company that maybe takes those cocoa, perhaps works with it in a different part of the world, and reintroduces it back into Ghana in the form of, for example, cocoa powder, or maybe it's some kind of product. Maybe they're using the palm oil to bring things together, to structure things together, to create some kind of food product. That's all governed in terms of trade and investment agreements. So trade is happening between countries. Often it's done in terms of, we want to invest in you, so we're going to bring things into your country, help build your economy, and in exchange, we're going to be able to set up factories, draw on your labor, create goods, and ultimately, that is another form of trade agreement, or in terms of an arrangement between us. And all of this then is supported by the flow of information. We live in the world of essentially what's happening around us with the World Wide Web, with social media, with this incredible rapid movement of information, but also the movement of finance, of cash. That, in a simple way, is what globalization is. This framing in which all of these things are moving. And just to give a little bit of a statistic, international trade as a proportion of global GDP doubled since the 1970s, and it's now almost 60% of gross domestic product globally. It is almost 2/3 of the entire globe's GDP in terms of the movement of goods through international trade. This is at the core of what our economies are. And we have to understand this if we are going to be able to understand how food is part of this, that then has this outcome in terms of health. Moving a little bit, Lizanne, we can then see how this particular structure is regulated in a country. Now let's think about where we sit. Cameroon, perhaps it's Malawi, maybe it's South Africa. We've got our own regulatory space, our own policies, which we try somewhat to mitigate the bad things that are happening in terms of globalization. So we don't want rampant capitalism. We don't want rampant exploitation, but we also want the benefits. So how do we enhance what we see as good and mitigate what we see as bad? So regulation comes into this. And that is at the interface of this trade environment and then the food environment in which we exist as human beings. All of us here sitting around this particular presentation today. We leave our spaces, our dwellings, we go off to either harvest ourselves, possibly rather procure or purchase our food. We engage with advertising, marketing, we engage with a whole world of information, what's on the shelves, and we then bring those in. We are worried about what kinds of foods because we've got information about what's healthy and nutritious, but we're also limited in terms of how much money we've got, for example, if we are purchasing. So all of that shapes and affects what we call the food environment. Prices of food, the availability of food and goods, how food is composed. And I already stress that. It's not necessarily just a whole food that we're looking at. We are looking at so many foods that are processed, that are composed of different elements. We also are affected by how those are promoted. Those national policies and regulators try somewhat to shape that, but behind it, what they're really trying to shape is what's happening with these powerful movements of resources, of agreements, of essentially where the real power of these goods moving is. What's also happening, and we're looking to the top now, is that as we are becoming increasingly globalized, so the economies of scale are increasing. We're getting bigger and bigger and bigger because we're moving more and more volumes of things around. So for example, if South Africa moves citrus to Europe or apples to China, so to meet those trade agreements, more and more land has to go under citrus and apple production, which means that it begins to affect and shape agricultural production. It begins to affect and shape the labor relations. It begins to affect the processing that may happen in terms of if we're producing apple juice or orange juice, or perhaps it's affecting what's happening in Switzerland as they're taking those oranges and creating something. It's affecting retail. So if we turn it around and we think about Malawi, we're thinking about how our retail system is shaped by those trade agreements to not only make available those food, but also to ensure that there's efficiency, that we're moving stocks and things quickly so that there's profit. And that's also then linked to that marketing. So just looking at that there, you can see the politics, the economics, and something of the health, those dimensions of those interconnected systems all beginning to be revealed. If you go a little bit further, Lizanne, we then begin to see that these then also shape our societies, who we are as we live within our households, but also our communities, our cities, our towns, our rural areas. Because all of these big, powerful movements, they're 60% of the global GDP. That means that they are shaping our economies. They're shaping our politics. They are affecting and influencing our politicians, because this is where the stakes begin to become the most valuable, resources the most valuable, and where the stakes are the highest. And so you begin to see then the shaping and the effect of globalization and trade on income and inequality, urbanization, labor relations, what happens within a household. Sometimes it shifts and shapes and changes those things as we rapidly urbanize, for example, a country like South Africa, almost 70% urbanized. But it also can reveal and change things in terms of, for example, allowing more labor into the market. So bringing women into the market in a place where previously that was only reserved for men. So it has shapings in terms of other systems beginning to get affected. Now again, and we're going to move on to the end of this particular framework, thanks Lisanne, just to look at it, all of these things interact, and all of these things then through those interconnections create and shape this thing called nutrition and the health outcomes that are related. So if we look back at this, and we think about what's in front of us, we have that system, that food system in the center. We have agreed that we are not naive enough to think that food is produced locally, that moves through a value chain and ultimately ends up on our plate, but that in fact, that inner system, that value chain, is not only local, but it's also at a global level. Around it are massive power structures around the economy, massive power structures around politics, and ultimately the shaping and effect of health. And this framing gives us a sense of being able to make sense, to see these different elements so that we are able to ask questions, ask good research questions, so that we can interrogate these things to get a better idea of what's happening on that bottom right, nutrition and related health outcomes. Colleagues, there's a lot that we could talk about here. I just wanted to provide this framework. The references here, we've got the documentation if you'd like us to share it later, but certainly it's here for you for an immediate reference. And now just to turn over to Lisanne, who's going to take us really into understanding some of those real dynamics of what's happening within the human body and those nutrition outcomes. Thanks, Lisanne.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you for just setting the scene so beautifully for our talk this afternoon. And good afternoon or evening to everyone online. And thank you for joining us here in this presentation. So I just want to quickly remind you of two organizations that we are busy not maybe talking about, but in essence, they govern the things that we are talking about to you. So if we look on the slide here, we know that international trade through the World Trade Organization has a highly structured and formalized and very demanding governance system, whereas the World Health Organization, which is the one that I think most of us on the call most often refer to as the global entity that governs a lot of what we do. In contrast with the World Trade Organization, the WHO has in its governance system, well, I don't want to say little, but sometimes they do say it's little structural coherence. And there is a greater diversity of actors also and approaches in this organization, but also weaker legal obligations on the states. So when we consider these differences between these two organizations, it is quite clear and easy to see why trade has so far dominated over health in the governance of the relationship. And this creates very important challenges for the public health community. And it also then brings us to the question, move the slides. Sorry, here we go. The question on how can global health best be protected and promoted amidst rapidly expanding trade relations? So I'll put that question out to you. And some authors, like MacDonald and Horton, which is portrayed here on the slide, they have actually come up with a challenge to the health sector and to health professionals to get involved in the trade debate. And I'll just read to you what they say to us. And I accept and imply then that many of the audience work in health. So they say that there is no denying that trade is a political issue. It is perhaps for this reason and because many health professionals perceive trade as a complex, unrelated or remote factor in their practice and busy working lives, that the health sector has traditionally avoided getting involved in trade debates. But the fact that trade directly and also indirectly affects the health of the global population with an unrivaled reach and depth undoubtedly makes it a key health issue that the global health community can no longer ignore. But unfortunately, as these authors say, to date, the health sector has been a strikingly absent advocate in fighting for a fairer trade system. Now, when I lecture my students on health promotion and health communication, we often say that health is already such a complex issue and nutrition is equally complex. And I think we are so focused on the complexity of the systems and the very specific professions that we work in that we don't even see trade as part of something that we should be getting involved in. But as you see here, the challenge is put to us that we should become advocates in this space. And in the same breath, I also often say that we are not very good at always advocating for health or advocating for nutrition. So we really need, in my opinion, need to be upskilled in becoming then the advocates that we should. And also, as Scott mentioned right in the beginning, this group, specifically our postgraduate students, becoming the global activists also that we should be. Just having a little bit of issues moving to the next slide. Here we go. Okay. So as an example of a commodity that can be traded in, Scott and I decided to focus here on ultra-processed foods or ultra-processed products, as they are also sometimes referred to. And it is also something that both Scott and I work with because he works often in the food systems world, where I work in maternal, infant, and young child nutrition. And in these, we see the flood of ultra-processed products in the market. And I want to draw you right to the ultra-processed food industry in Africa as part of the title of this talk, and focus on this commentary that was published in Nature Food last year. Now, in this commentary, the authors highlight a very specific partnership between Nestlé and the Alliance for a Green Revolution. That was last year. They say last year. That means it was in 2022. And they say here that these two framed this specific partnership as to help accelerate the transformation of food systems in Africa as a way of strengthening the continent's food security and building greater climate change resilience. So they are speaking right to the problems that we know we have in access to nutrition, improving food security, eliminating hunger, facilitating economic growth. And they also put a focus here specifically on small-scale farmers, local farmers, in creating sustainable food value chains. So they are speaking to our hearts here because we are worried about this specific domain. But what the authors highlight here is, they say, but what exactly are the implications of partnering with the world's largest ultra-processed food manufacturer, that's Nestlé they're referring to Africa's sustainable food systems agenda? Right, so what are the implications here of partnering with a company or a manufacturer like this? Now, Nestlé is one of these companies, but on the slide, you can see that there are 10 global companies that control the processed and ultra-processed food market, and they are seen in the middle of this slide. And you can also see the very many smaller companies that branch off from these companies, and also brands, of course, that branch off from them. On this slide, I want to show you, though, that 6 of these 10 companies from the previous slide are also the world's worst offenders for plastic pollution. But what is happening is that these companies and their broader industries are positioning themselves as part of the solution to the problems that I just mentioned to you on the slide there from Nature Food. And they are positioning themselves here while they are also expanding rapidly into low and middle income countries, including in Africa. And this is happening while the world's attention is on the sustainability of food systems. So you can maybe hear just the very many concepts that are coming into play over just 3 slides that I've mentioned to you. And they are in opposition to one another, these concepts. So let me take you to a few articles that really or underscore some of the things that we want to highlight with this talk. Now, the harmful effects of ultra-processed food and so on is not a new debate. This article was published more than a decade ago already. It was from Rob Moody and co-workers on profits and pandemics. And what these authors give us as key messages are that transnational corporations are major drivers of NCDs and profit from the increased consumption of tobacco and alcohol and ultra-processed foods and drinks. And although tobacco is now facing larger restrictions, you can see there the underlined bit is that alcohol and ultra-processed food and drink industries use similar strategies to the tobacco industry to undermine effective public health policies and programs. And I remind you that part of the title of this talk is about trade and policy and global health. So these unhealthy commodity industries, says the authors, should have no role in the formation of national or international policy, specifically when we talk about NCDs. And they also feel strongly that what we have seen over time is that despite the reliance of industry on self-regulation and public-private partnerships to improve public health, the authors found, and they state very clearly, that there's no evidence to support their effectiveness or safety, this self-regulation. And then lastly, the authors of this paper made their view very clear in saying that because of the present and predicted scale of NCDs, the only evidence-based mechanism that can prevent harm caused by unhealthy commodity industries are public regulation and market intervention. Now, fast forward a decade, then we see that the Lancet now also shines a light on these very issues. And a whole series was dedicated to the commercial determinants of health in 2023, where they acknowledge and they recognize that there are certain commercial actors that contribute positively to health and society, but a substantial group of commercial actors are escalating avoidable levels of ill health, planetary damage, and inequity. So on the next slide, I'll show you the 3 papers in the series, and I urge you to read the series just also to understand and come to a deeper insight on what the specific determinants of health, the commercial determinants of health are all about. And then lastly, I want to highlight this specific publication from very recently, Slater and co-workers. What they did was they looked at the mapping and analysis of corporate interest groups. And corporate interest groups are groups that lobby on behalf of other companies, and in this case, the ultra-processed food industry. And what they found was that here on the slide, you will see in this colorful ball right in the middle, those are the same companies, the 10 companies that I showed you on a previous slide. And they mapped out all these different interest groups linked to these companies. And what they saw was that there were around 268 interest groups linked to these industries. So they say that Nestlé has 171 interest groups, and then they list them they're going down: Coca-Cola, Unilever, PepsiCo, and Danone. All of them have more than 100 of these corporate interest groups that do many different things. They are involved in sustainability issues and also social responsibility activities, multi-stakeholder initiatives, and some of them are also involved in branding and advertising and marketing and retail. So you can see that these groups are very diverse. They are very connected and interconnected. And the authors of this specific paper then go on to be very clear on what they think we should be doing. And they stated right there at the bottom, they say that the key global food government decision makers, their attempts to drive systemic change towards healthier food systems must address both these ultra-processed food companies, the big ones, but they should also be looking at these other interest groups. And they need to show up that these companies and their allies should be positioned as core to the problem and not part of the solution, as they are currently positioning themselves as. So these are just a few thoughts that Scott and I wanted to share with you, and just to stimulate some debate and take it right back to you and ask that you also now make your voice heard. And I can already see that there is some discussion in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. du Plessis and Prof. de Moor. I know definitely that I have a lot of thoughts on what has just been discussed. We are switching over now to the Q&A section. And I'll just start us off in terms of, with my question, because I haven't seen anything else in the chat. And I think you rightly spoke towards the end about how these big companies need to be positioned as the problem, and we need to have, and not necessarily what they're doing now in terms of positioning themselves as part of the solution. So my question essentially is, how do we get them to be part of the solution without them being positioned? Because in my mind, there needs to be some level of accountability in terms of them contributing to the problem that they're causing. Does it mean we tax them more? How do we get them involved in the solution without giving them the credit and the credit they're giving themselves by positioning themselves as being part of the solution? Because they are gaining a lot of economic benefit from where they are. So how do we use that economic benefit to our,
Scott, I don't know if you wanted to jump in, maybe while you adjust your screen or just show your face. I can maybe just say that I think it has become clear that we should be setting the rules of engagement. So whenever there is a discussion about any involvement of industry, it should not be industry that set the rules, but we should be taking that power by saying we will set the rules of engagement. It's not as easy because these are very powerful entities, and I think we must acknowledge that. But in the same breath, if you think of nutrition and NCDs, and in my specific domain of work, maternal, infant, and young child nutrition, I cannot justify that these companies are involved in policy talks when they are the very companies that undermine global public health and national policy by very many ways. We just saw their very interconnectedness with so many different ways of, I don't want to say smoke screens, but it might as well be that, where you don't even always know when you are busy engaging with a specific group that may have a link to these companies. It also raises another issue that I think many of you may have in mind around conflict of interest, and how do we engage with these companies or not at all? We have very many examples of these companies wanting to sponsor our events, like our congresses or symposiums, and should we give them that platform? That's the question. Should they be made visible on platforms that we create to try and solve some of the most pressing issues in public health? So in my opinion, there is a break in trust between us and many of these companies. And in that case, then I would not say that they should have a chair at the table when we discuss solutions to the problems that they have a great part in. You had an interesting question, and I would like to draw Scott in here as how do we use them to our benefit? So maybe Scott has some insights on that.
Yeah. I remain skeptical that that kind of power, that kind of scale can in fact be drawn in, because it's not only the illustration that you raised in terms of the dominant companies and the connections they have back into their brands. That's almost the front of face. If we go back to our conceptual framework, we realize that the entire production system is also geared, is being shaped by those companies or those interests in order to create the products, the ingredients that then become these ultra-processed food products. So, for example, the production in West Africa, these are no longer diverse mixed livelihood systems creating sort of food systems for local consumption, but they are massive plantations that are then moving across the world. It's been affected and shaped by that. And I think a very interesting activist, Raj Patel, talks of this in terms of cheap and nasty. And he looks at that in terms of the laborers that are on the plantations, how much they are paid, and just how much of their sacrifice is then translated into the cheapness of those goods, which means that it is more widely available. So when you start to countenance in those terms, it becomes akin to thinking about some of these big production systems of 200, 300 years ago in terms of plantation agriculture, a world of gross exploitation. And if we see it in those terms, then the kind of reaction and response is that we need to dismantle. And we've got to be doing this in terms of shining lights on this. This is my reaction. But I also have the sense that in engaging with them, by excluding them, you are forcing them into their own corner, and those corners are very powerful. So by not allowing them to shape health policy, but by excluding them from those dialogues could be equally dangerous and problematic because they have the wherewithal to do it. So it's about putting the light on, understanding the issues, but then really being able to look at it from positions of power by really raising these perspectives. And again, I'm sorry, it becomes an ideological. And again, locked into those power relations. I don't even begin to talk about shareholders and who controls and things like that. But let me leave it there in terms of a general reaction, and hopefully that's a little bit of provocation here. Nice, Vanessa, about confusing due to social media. So absolutely, social media controlled by certain powers who can get those messages out in the most dominant way. We're seeing it happening right now in terms of infant and young child feeding, and controlling that getting into households and communities in terms of what's good, what's wholesome, what's nutrition, and that providing then confusion. And then behind confusion, you get things, opportunities for maneuver.
Maybe while we wait for another comment or a question, Scott, when you said it's dangerous to push these industries into a corner, I remember very well at the 2010 Tshwane meeting where South Africa declared itself as a breastfeeding friendly country, and very many declarations were put on the table of things that need to happen so that we can become that breastfeeding friendly country and breastfeeding supportive country. And at that meeting, the WHO legal representative of the time was on the speaker, and he was saying that while we are meeting, they are meeting. While we are planning, they are planning. And the commercial milk formula companies were very clearly excluded from that meeting. And I remember so clearly how when he finished his speech, one of these companies' representatives, the commercial milk formula, got up. She was there. She got up, she walked out, and I thought, oh my word. So yeah, they are listening in, although they were not invited, they are there in very many different ways, and they will be planning while we are planning. In saying this, I think the commercial milk formula and breastfeeding space is definitely one that we have a lot of mistrust in, and there is so much evidence why we should not be engaging them in this space. But we can see the damage that they do, and they continue to do, even though we have regulations in place and we have much more evidence on the table about the power of breastfeeding and everything around that. Still, this remains a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Thank you so much for both of those contributions. I just, a question or a comment was left in the chat before one person had to leave. I just wanted to get your perspective on this. Gabriella Carlos said, thank you for the well-balanced discussion. She explained she needed to exit. She said we should look at the weak actors / hidden actors involved in systemic exploitation and the value of influence in governance through the cross-pollination of trade regulations too. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that in terms of like the weak actors or hidden actors. Are there perhaps potential actors that we aren't necessarily looking at when we're thinking of trade and policy and nutrition, all of like the things that impact health? Just wanted your thoughts on that.
I'm willing to have a first response to that. Very recently, we had a World Food Summit, which ostensibly brought together many countries through government representations into the UN in order to look at the state of the global food system, but within the perspective of different regions and countries. And in that process, there was a great deal of development of food system strategies. And just thinking about who was involved and who led that, yes, the process was often held by government, but those that participated were often those that had the most interest or the greatest stake in the system, and those were often the powerful. So in the case of South Africa, civil society voices. Now, this is about food systems, not just about health and nutrition. It's about that core as it intersects with those other systems that I mentioned right at the beginning. In the South African case, a very well-meaning government delegation offered a very powerful framing in terms of what was required in South Africa. But the real influence behind that were the conversations that was held often by agribusiness and government, and civil society voices were minimal. There were very, very few smallholder farmers, small-scale farmers, subsistence farmers, bakkie traders, retailers, informal traders associations. These types of entities were ultimately, the argument was that they were invited and there were attempts to engage, but the reality was that there was very little. So when you look at it like that, we've got to be very careful in terms of trying to make that visible to government, but recognizing that there's also interests that are at play and that some of those interests do not want these other voices in there because it makes things too complicated. It's not as straightforward. It doesn't talk to GDP or the things that we measure in terms of economic growth. It doesn't talk about foreign direct investment and trade coming in here. It doesn't talk to jobs creation in the formal sector. So when you have that kind of approach, that is what we're looking at in terms of any manifesto you look at through political parties at the moment. They're not talking about creation of livelihoods in the informal, messy economy. That's not what they're offering. So it's more in the interests of political parties that form governments to have these relationships where you bring in the big finances so that you are able to then formalize the economy such that it's well regulated and managed and taxed and it contributes to the fiscus and it's neat and it's tidy, as opposed to the messiness. And if you look at it like that, you begin to realize why certain voices are silenced or neglected or marginalized and others are not. So we've got to be careful about all of this in terms of recognizing motivation, recognizing where the incentives or the agendas are emerging from. And it isn't always a polarized good and bad. It isn't always about ideology. It's a very complicated set of factors. And I think there are some within us here that are part of government. I can, recognize many in terms of this group that are engaged in some of these things. These are complex real life issues that people are facing. And what we've got to be doing is really exposing this, making this well known so that we're able to engage. So that's an immediate reaction to that. Thanks, Design.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you. I see there's another comment that has been posted from Renel Sorgenvrij. Thank you. Interesting discussion. Within the space I work, I've noticed the audacity of the big companies and the entanglement within the politics and society. Often these companies are viewed as heroes by the public and government, and any opposition is framed. Sorry, I lost my cursor there. Framed as wanting to limit development, an expert being framed as a bad actor. I would also like to refer to the influence of some of these actors on guidelines that we use in healthcare, the conflict of interest. Yes, my opinion is that exclusion does not work and regulatory management often is bypassed because of this undue influence. Though my wish would be to exclude, I believe there needs to be a very honest look by the industry of their action, which I doubt from experience they would be willing to acknowledge. Thank you for that, Renel. I know that from a perspective of working for government and often being, I think, involved in tenders and tender processes also, where some of these big companies feature. It is hard to distance yourself, but also, as you say here, sometimes they are viewed as the heroes. And when we say what we say, then we are the ones that are the bad players, or the unhappy people, or the nutrition police. Sometimes, as I refer to us in what we sometimes need to do. So absolutely acknowledge what you are saying here. And I think it is hard because we are taught from our undergrad studies that we work together. Some of our slogans, even in government, says better together. And we want to work as multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral teams. That's often the solution that we put forward to some of our complex problems. But in doing that, do you exclude? Do you include? If you want to include and you do, will it be hijacked? Those are the questions that come to mind. And I think we've said quite a bit about that already this afternoon. Scott, I don't know if you want to maybe add anything to that. I see you actually responded to Renel. And then there's a last from Vanessa. The conflict between economics and health. How do we try and balance this? As it is rightfully pointed out, there's great economic benefit to having these big actors involved, even when it is at a cost to health overall. How do we create social accountability with teeth when we don't have much power? Scott, would you like to respond to that?
Mm-hmm. So Vanessa, thank you. And I can only here speak about the experience of a particular context, and that is the story of South Africa. So we have very fledgling, very very diminished social movements that are trying to shift things. And that's one of the reasons why we have so much social protest. People are angry, they're disillusioned, and ways of expressing themselves tend to then be in these sort of social protest means. And I think this is well conceptualized in a lot of political science. We used to have, for example, a very strong land movement in South Africa. After 94, a strong NGO, civil society grouping, working with the Mandela government, taking on the Mbeki government, pushing them in terms of land reform. But that was systematically diminished over time. And to this day, we have a very weak land movement in South Africa. Land reform is not an issue, really. Perhaps pops up every now and again when particular political parties raise it. But by and large, we feel that we're doing relatively well. The president will say that we've reached a significant proportion of our goals. When it comes to food and nutrition, we're even worse off. We do not have these big social movements that are picking up on these issues and really driving it. Although we are beginning to see the beginnings of these movements. So, for example, there are groups of researchers and activists, some of them connected to Wits University, University of Western Cape, others that are connected to activists set up with NGOs, connected to small-scale farmers that are already raising questions of, for example, what's happening around the sugar levy, the sugar tax. So you've got research that is then driving the evidence to say, this is a good idea. You've got activists that are picking it up and beginning to take it into the policy domains alongside the researchers, taking it to Treasury, taking it to the Department of Health, the Nutrition Division, and beginning to persuade officials that they themselves see these issues and are sympathetic and sensitive, and slowly but surely beginning to build a new alliance and network. So by doing it in a way that is systematic, that is connected, that is building its own power, you can begin to offset because you change the language. In Brazil, we've seen subsequent political parties take control, create some of the most progressive food and nutrition policies globally. Another political party takes over, it systematically dismantles it. That original party comes back into power and then retries to connect it again. There you've got democracy and voice and ideology and movements beginning to affect and shape it. And we don't have that politics here in South or Southern, or even I would say Sub-Saharan Africa, to the extent that we need in order to shift these things. But that is where the possibilities are, in my view. And we should be taking inspiration from elsewhere, but we should be also engaged in terms of, as a researcher, how do we connect to the activist groups? How do we support them? How do we make friends with officials? How do we draw them in? How do we connect and understand what's going on inside of the private sector, understand their minds, so that we can begin to engage it in ways that are different, not just about aggressive, angry, shouting across the rooftops, but very strategic, quite sensitive, understand who is really behind those corporates. Where does real power lie? What are the real stakeholders, the investors? What are they the most afraid of? They're afraid of being identified and connected to things like driving poor health in terms of urban informal economies. If you could take an investor group, you link them to child death, linked to poor nutrition and health, can you imagine that damage? And if we can be thinking in those kind of ways, I think we could be making better and stronger change. That's a little bit of my own ideology and a little bit of my idealism coming through, but that's how I would react. And I'm sorry that I went on a bit long. Sorry.
That's no problem at all, Scott. It's always fascinating to listen to you. And I think you are very right. We have a history in South Africa of very powerful campaigning. And there's one specific, the Treatment Action Campaign, that is cited globally as one of the strongest activist groups and one of the best examples of what can happen when civil society and other actors come together and put pressure on, for instance, government. So we have some examples from our own country where these kinds of advocacy movements is possible. So we have a lot to do, I think. But in the same breath, I think we are sometimes so busy with what we are busy with that we have little energy left and little creativity and imagination to do more of that. So maybe we should think and reflect more about how we go about to follow the example that we have from our own country.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the view of trying to link the problem to the problem, and I wonder in an ideal world if we be able to like achieve that, what that would lead to. For example, connecting a company to the problems that they're causing, but at what consequence? Yeah, I've thoroughly enjoyed the opinions and the expert opinions shared, and I just want to give both Prof. du Plessis and Prof. Drimi opportunity to sort of give closing remarks in light of there being no more questions in the chat. I think just to sum it all up, so much has been raised and so many different perspectives have been raised on this topic, and I personally know I'm gonna sit and marinate after this and think through this more, because we could be talking for another hour or two if we were to go into depth in terms of all the different factors at play. But yeah, I think, yeah, just a few minutes, just closing thoughts or a send-off message, that would be really appreciated.
Maybe I can quickly start and then hand over to Scott. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to this specific audience. I think it's a much needed group, this community of practice, to think about issues of global health. And today we've given you a very specific issue around trade, policy, and public health issues with the nutrition example coming through. And I think what Scott mentioned right in the beginning about being global activists, combined with what I said around advocacy and communication and so forth, I think it is a very good idea to upskill ourselves in those specific skills so that we can speak with confidence about these things, and also not only speak but do. And there's much room for that, I think, in our curriculums, both undergrad and postgrad, to learn how to become the advocates that we should be, not only for health, nutrition, but also for things that impact on us, like trade. And I think more and constructive dialogue and debate around policy issues will also definitely help us, because to know how these things impact on us is extremely important. And bringing people into the room like Scott with his political economy lens is very, very helpful to understand very many of the complex and stuck issues that we have. So the more we can do together as different colleagues from different backgrounds and help each other to understand what is going on in and around our specific professions, I think the stronger we will become at being advocates. Thank you.
Thank you, Lizanne. I don't want to add too much to that. The conceptual framework at the beginning laid out all of the different systems how they intersect. It laid it out so that we could see ourselves in the system, but also see what's happening around these different actors and how they're connected. So when we see things, when these power arrangements become visible, we can then work out what it is that's required in terms of engaging those intersections. And that for me is about so much about what you hold in terms of asking the questions, doing the research, and becoming those advocates for the change. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you both so much for the closing remarks. I think there is indeed, like I already mentioned, a lot of room for all of us to think about our role within the system and to think about this aspect that we've been neglecting for so long, which is trade and economics and the interplay of politics into all of the things and of health outcomes ultimately. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this. I'm just going to hand over to Prof. Renee English, who's just also going to give us some closing remarks as we close off the webinar. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Prof. English, if you are speaking, we can't hear you.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Hello,
Yes,
can you?
loud and clear.
Oh, good. Thank you. Sorry, I had to change my settings. I'm so glad you didn't leave the meeting. Thank you very much. I'm working off my phone today because I had to drive from one meeting to the other, but I listened in. I just want to express my appreciation to both you, Lizania and Scott, for an amazing presentation to the students. Just to say that these presentations that we do will be shared as well with the international students. Many of them cannot attend it live, but listen to it and ask for it quite religiously after each meeting. And mine are really two, I think, reflections, because I've been thinking a lot about food and the influence of trade and global policy and all the things that were spoken about now. And my one reflection is something that I've been thinking about since I returned from Morocco a few weeks ago. So I was there for a week. It was a structured visit that I went on with a number of colleagues. But what I noticed very early on in my visit was just how there were no fast food outlets other than one very familiar chain that you get very regularly along the way. And I remember they advertised a meal from another regular chain, but I never saw that chain anywhere. And I still joked with my colleagues at the time and said, "Oh, I'd like to taste that thing that they're advertising," but I never found one. And then the second was the culture. The culture is such, it's obviously a Mediterranean diet, and the culture is that the fast foods, the sort of highly palatable processed foods, it's not what they eat on a daily basis. And I was so struck and wondered, well, what are the policies that facilitates that in that country compared to a country like South Africa? And then the second is I met with some community members. We meet regularly with them just to talk about some of the issues that they face. And today, again, the question was posed, well, what is the truth regarding food? What are we supposed to eat? How are we supposed to eat? And they spoke about cheap food, how easy it is to buy cheap food, how communities do not have money to buy food that's more expensive, and how expensive fruit and vegetables are. But at the same time, acknowledging that to buy pulses and legumes is cheaper than to buy meat, but the culture dictates that you must have meat in your food. So as I said, not really any questions, but just building on the importance of us understanding these issues and of teaching it to our students so that they, as the next generation, are able to take this fight forward, and it can be an informed fight. So again, Scott and Lizanne, you are so well versed in your discipline and you're so passionate and you speak so clearly. And we are going to be referring to these recordings for a very long time to come. So thank you very much. And again, as I always do, I want to express my appreciation to the students who participated and the students who
Sorry, I was struggling for a moment. Thank you so much, Prof, for that for the summary. Just in terms of those who are here, I will be sharing the recording of the session through our email group as usually done. It will also eventually be put up on our website at some point. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll see you at the next webinar. I'll also be sending a feedback or review form via our email chain as well, just to get feedback on the session. Thank you guys so much. And once again, thank you, Prof. Du Plessis and Prof. Drimi. Today was really insightful. Thank you so much. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evenings.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.